There's been this strange talk in the last several days since the news, the Latin Mass alleged ban has been coming down, and with every noteworthy confirmation of that document, though we should still call it alleged until it happens, combined with the crackdown on Vigano and all of his supporters and things, and it's almost a meme that they're pushing out there. And it's the idea is this: that traditional Catholics, when their Latin Mass is taken away, many, if not most, will leave the church. I want you to understand that that is a terrible idea, of course, if you decide you're going to go that way. But the reason Francis is, there are a few reasons Francis is reportedly going to all but totally ban the traditional Mass. Most insiders report that Francis doesn't care about the traditional Mass by itself, and you can see evidence for that in his relations he had with the SSPX in Argentina, which was reportedly pretty positive, according to SSPX insiders. His reasons can be reduced to a few, and this all has to do with the idea of people wanting traditional Catholics out of the church. But his first reason is he legitimately thinks this is an issue of unity being undermined in the church. After all, in the mass media age and the age of the internet, the traditionalist movement has been growing, especially in the aftermath of Summorum Pontificum, but even more so in the age of Francis. He doesn't understand that he is himself the driving factor of much of this growth of the traditional Mass. When his changes in the faith came down the line and started getting repeated at the pulpit, many people started looking for the same faith that they always had. And they heard, a bunch of us on the fringes talking about these issues and decided to see if we were right by going to a traditional Mass. Francis was our best advertisement. But our growth in popularity, whether it's in the blogging side of things, the YouTube side of things, or this is the one no one talks about, in the face-to-face interaction between normal Catholics who happen to be dedicated to the traditional teachings of the church and the traditional liturgy, those interactions have caused this to happen, especially in those dioceses where, again, when you look at the Latin Mass locator, half in the United States of the traditional Mass offerings are at diocesan parishes, at least half. When you have a traditionalist, we'll put in quotes here, a traditionalist, a label I've never really cared for anyway, but when you put somebody like that, having a conversation with somebody who's been curious about it at the same parish, you start to see these things happen. And this is, Francis claims this is all undermining unity in the church because of loud voices working against him. His second reason is he has said this repeatedly, that his job, the reason he was placed on the throne of Peter, is to implement Vatican II, to finish implementing it, which he erroneously believed called for a new Mass when it did not, and believed that it called for the suppression of the traditional Mass when it did not. There are a number of ways to view what Vatican II was and what the documents say, but he comes from the wing that developed in the aftermath of the conciliar order of the more radical revolutionary side of things. They're the ones who got to implement the new Mass and who quietly suppressed it, even though it was never formally suppressed. He believes the will of the council was to replace the traditional Mass with the Novus Ordo. You can't find that in any of the documents, but that's what he believes. And so he believes that's his same mission to do so. In the same way that the Vatican II document on the Eastern rites of the church called for them to explicitly cling to their traditions and to stop making their masses more Roman, he has enforced that to the T. That's why you get the weird division here where you'll see right now, the biggest debate on this is the Syro-Malabar rite in India, where you have people who want the Syro-Malabar rite said according to the will of the council, which is to be fully in line with the traditions of the church, versus those who want a more Novus Ordo version of it, to the point where their debates aren't like these strident internet debates, which are very civil compared to what's going on in India. Now you have priests pushing each other off the altar in the middle of Mass, both using the same altar to say Masses at the same time. You have scuffles breaking out in the streets over this stuff in India. Okay? This is a dichotomy where Francis says things that sound very traditional. He is enforcing Vatican II. He believes that, and I take him at his word on that. because you see it demonstrated in his dealings with other places, especially right now with India, which doesn't get enough reporting. Even I've slacked on the reporting on what's going on there, and I should fix that. There's a third one. People whisper about this one. Be careful how we say it, but there are political considerations to this. And I don't mean ecclesiastical politics. Secular forces see my own governments keeping tabs on traditional Catholics, and Francis's ties to them as a good example of this. Those stories broke last year. Whenever I reported on them, all of a sudden my channel wasn't performing very well afterwards, and it was in the analytics. I could see that mysteriously our totally fair and free host stopped sending my videos to people after I reported on them for months. Just got to be careful here on this, but in the United States, where they believe this is mostly happening at the US and France, which is the two biggest countries for traditional Catholicism, there are considerations involving with the secular political order. And I guarantee you it's not just in the United States where the powers that should not be in the secular realm were keeping tabs on mass-going Catholics. You see this to some degree in Germany with what the media talk, how the media talks about divisions in the church and the things that they say there. There's right now in Switzerland, I'll talk about this probably over the weekend, but for whatever reason, the bishop there the bishop over at Cologne, Switzerland, where the SSPX major seminary is, their primary seminary, their historic one, they're about to ordain a bunch of priests. And for whatever reason, the local bishop is trying to stop it. He will be as successful as stopping it as they were stopping Archbishop Lefebvre from ordaining priests, which is to say they won't be. But you see this interaction between the secular world and the church in the way that it frankly shouldn't be happening, but it is happening. That is a consideration here. But ultimately, this is about ecclesiology. Ecclesiology is that fancy word from theology that just basically means the theology of what the church is, how the church should operate in the world, what the mission of the church is in the world, and the relationship of the church to the world. You want some evidence from this from Vatican II? All you got to do is look at the pre-conciliar condemnations on religious liberty and ecumenism and how they have been flipped on their head after Vatican II with backing from Vatican II documents. There's your prime example of ecclesiology and how it was changed. Remember what Cardinal Roche and Francis have said, that the ecclesiology of the church after Vatican II is not compatible with the traditional mass. And that is key to this. The extreme modernists, the Bergoglians, they hate the old Catholic Church. They are the spiritual sons of those who pushed through the council the ambiguous and problematic documents that have led to the biggest changes in what the church is in relation to the world. And that's why he's banning the Latin Mass. We can never go back to the church of old. And if that means banning the Latin Mass and forcing people out, then that's what he'll do. Why? Because traditional Catholics want the same faith as our ancestors. We want the same worship. We want the same forms of the sacraments. We want the same sacramentals. And we want the church to act the way it did before the council in its relationship to the world. To not be a cheerleader for a lot of questionable things the secular authorities are doing, but to actually stand in opposition to them. Even if it is a more peaceful way than many of us would prefer, they do it in terms of the rhetoric and things, but we want the church to not be on the same side as the secular authorities on virtually everything. Pope Francis spoke at the G7 recently. It's so weird, right? I mean, there was no UN before, before World War II, but Pius XII never addressed the UN. I don't think he even wrote a letter to them. I don't think John the 23rd did either. Paul VI was the first to go and address them. And it has been like that since then. And that body is profoundly anti-Catholic. It just is. There's a meme out there that people will leave the church if Francis bans the Latin Mass. Don't let them do that to you. That's the whole point of what they're doing. They cannot force the change of ecclesiology on the church, finish the job of it, if there are Catholics in fairly large numbers there who are very vocal about keeping to the same faith as always. This disregards the point, by the way, of I shouldn't have to make the point, extra ecclesia nulla salus. I shouldn't have to make that dogmatic point that you are playing with fire, spiritually speaking, with your salvation if you leave the Catholic Church. I shouldn't have to tell you that. But anybody who's considering that radical move have already probably put into serious doubt in their own minds and in their hearts the claims of the church historically. There was some high-profile traditional Catholic social media couple who went from being like diocesan TLM to the Orthodox. That's a huge shift. They jumped over multiple other options, including the SSPX. There has been a wonderful job done by, I'll put wonderful in quotes here, by certain media figures to make you think that the SSPX are evil. I'm not a huge cheerleader for them. People think that I am. I'm not. I am pro every TLM option you can get. Every place where you can get the traditional faith taught to you and the traditional sacraments and all the rest of it. I'll leave the internal squabbles about that stuff to people more interested in that. I'm not terribly interested in it. Seek them out before you think you're going to leave the church. They're not in schism. They've never been declared to be formally in schism. They have never been. There have been statements made by Benedict XVI and others that have said that the issue with them is an internal church debate. Take them at their word. Don't leave the church. And I said that long intro on this for a reason. And that long intro was because Rate Caeli published this. I couldn't believe they did this. They give us this headline: if the traditional Latin Mass is banned, many attendees will simply leave the church. Prove the author of this wrong. We'll scroll down here to see which one wrote it. Someone called themselves DC Rosary Rally. Okay, well, prove the anonymous author of this wrong. If you are even entertaining that thought, by just finding whatever option you have, but staying in the church. Okay, it's the worst advice you could ever have for anybody to even entertain that idea. There is no salvation outside the church. The other options, the apostolic options, are all in schism with Rome. Stay where you are. Keep the faith. But we'll give them their due. Here's their argument. In discussions of the suppression of the traditional Latin Mass, it is typically assumed that those who lose the TLM will simply move elsewhere, to the Novus Ordo first and foremost, but perhaps also to the SSPX or the Eastern churches. Thus, John Cavadini, Mary Healy, and Thomas Weinandi, citing nothing, described TLM attendees as quote, a self-selected group of highly motivated, attentive worshipers, many of them, ironically, nurtured on Vatican II sensibilities about full, conscious, active participation. Let's pause there. Full, active, conscious participation actually goes back to Pius X. If you want to read some of his writings on it, he called for full active participation of the laity at the Mass 50 years before the church, 60 years before the traditional Mass. Anyway, of course, such super Catholics are best plugged into the Novus Ordo, where it is assumed their worship may take, quote, outward expression in word, gesture, and song, instead of the purely silent, passive participation by the TLM. The authors ignore, of course, the beautiful Latin choirs and soaring hymns of the TLM, which contrast the half-hearted mumblings so typical of a modern Novus Ordo. Again, the author is giving his own take on the Novus Ordo. That's not my purpose here. I will interject and say we are a low Mass family. I started out with a high Mass. The low Mass is the more silent Mass, and those who have been going to the low Mass will understand the draw and the claim that people there aren't actively participating or actively participating enough is a real discredit. Yes, there are situations where people aren't able to because they have kids or something who are having a hard time behaving during the silent Mass, but praying in union with the priest at the altar, whether it's a rosary or you're praying through the liturgical book with him, whatever it is you're doing is active participation. Do not discount the power of prayer. Let's continue. Andrea Grillo, the academic described as the mind behind the recent restrictions, also urges that TLM attendees should be forced to relinquish the TLM and commit to, quote, work at a single table and contribute to enriching the only ritual form in force. Well, the traditional argument for enriching the Novus Ordo is banned by Traditionis Custodes. Explicitly says no accretions from the traditional Mass. That would be your communion on the tongue and altar rails. Only people at the altar are men. All those accretions that they call it, explicitly banned in Traditionis Custodes. And the man behind it should know. So it's just gaslighting. Pope Francis, in his letter accompanying Traditionis Custodes, states the goal of his restrictions is to force TLM worshippers to return in due time to the Novus Ordo. Some TLM attendees, indeed, for the stereotype of super Catholics who will happily go wherever their shepherds tell them to go, but most do not. My discussions, this is anecdotal, okay, anecdotal evidence, which is the worst kind of evidence, reveal that TLM attendees face the same pressures towards secularization that the rest of the church does. Many TLM attendees, especially the old timers, have seen their friends and family fall away from the faith. Really? Well, it's at lower numbers than at the ordinary form. Those are the raw statistics. You can't argue with them. They themselves have struggled with the burdens of the post-Vatican II church, irreverent liturgies and scandals of the flesh, especially McCarrick, which hit hard in Washington, D.C. The TLM is the only thing that keeps them going spiritually each week. They have no interest in being part of a church that ignores and bullies them, or participating in imagined discussions about making the Novus Ordo more reverent that are unlikely to ever occur. If the Mass goes, they will go as well. And don't, if that describes you, make the drive to a SSPX or FSSP or whatever other group, because those groups will be around at least for the time being. In the SSPX, short of some coordinated action by the secular authorities with the Vatican, it will be around too. They've been around for 50 years now. They'll be around. But this almost seems like you're being asked to leave. If that describes you, don't leave. The model of the church in which the restrictions succeed is not the church of today, shrinking and besieged in the secularized West. Most people alienated by Latin Mass restrictions won't magically resurface as the leaders of the Reform or the Reform. They will simply flee the grotesque spiritual evil that is being inflicted upon them and their children. And you can do that by not leaving the church. You give them what they want if you leave the church. Don't do it. I have no doubt that there are some people who are entertaining it. For the life of me, I can't figure out why people would go to the Orthodox other than for the aesthetics. I get it. And for valid sacraments, I get it. But you're going to find there many of the same problems. I have covered their women's ordination issues on this channel. I have covered on this channel their own McCarrick stuff. Not to go pick at them, but because the grass is not greener on the other side, to borrow a term from the pop culture. Joe Byrne says, if the modern Mass is not offering sacredness and salvation, then it is irrelevant and a total waste of time. As I said before, it's like a pub with no beer. All that is required that you sanctify the Lord's Day and receive the body and blood of our Lord once during the Easter season. I watch SSPV Masses every Sunday and go to communion 1 to 2 times a year. I personally can't endorse that far, but I can't also condemn anybody for it. This is the kind of thing people make. These are the decisions people make. Alan says they want to end the presence of Jesus, body, blood, soul, and divinity on earth, and end the continuing offering and game over. I mean, there are probably people in the secular world who don't realize it's their goal. Because I can't picture anybody in the secular world overtly talking in terms of like that, because it means they accept our claims about the Mass. But they absolutely want to end all vestiges of the old faith. And I'm going to now show you, I'm not the only one responding to this, because, I'm not that good at responding to these things, but I will tell you who is. And that's Father Z. He got a similar letter that kind of embodies what the author at Rurate Caeli is talking about. And here is what he has to say. So let's start with the letter he got. Dear Father, I feel unsafe going to church, which I unfortunately cannot bring myself to do. I firmly believe in the Catholic faith and all of its traditional teachings. However, going to Mass anywhere has proved to be such a discomfort to me that I fear I may never go again. I feel gravely uncomfortable attending Mass in the company of those priests who are themselves racked with limitless sinful things and heresy. I feel completely hypocritical for listening to them. Half of them appear to be of the James Martin crowd, and I can't bear the thought of touching their hand, much less by that same hand receiving Holy Communion. Also, due to recent scandals regarding the seal of confession, I do not entirely trust the clergy to absolute secrecy. Wow. Least to say, Father, I feel quite lost as a Catholic and experience only feelings of disgust and affliction in the company of other Catholics, especially priests. You will tell me to go to confession, which I have tried many times over. What I'm telling you is that I am disillusioned, and I'm afraid that such disillusionment is irreparable. I do not feel compassion or understanding in this church, which has become a circus for pseudo-intellectuals and the people of the women's ideology. I wish I could feel right at home, but I don't. I don't. I've entertained thoughts of becoming Orthodox or even Anglican, but I can't bring myself to do so. I believe from a chiefly historical point of view that the Roman Catholic Church is the true church established by Christ. I also cannot escape a deep sense of faith to that end. But when I think of the Catholic Church I believe in and love, I do not see it in the one which currently claims the title. There appears to be a complete dichotomy between the two. It is as if the Catholic faith were divorced from visual representation, church buildings, and everything institutional that we cannot visibly see. I would greatly appreciate your wisdom and guidance. I have long read your blog and hope for you nothing but the deepest respect. Okay. Half of the priests are not of the James Martin crowd. They're not. I have repeatedly told you over and over and over again that all reports are, and I'm not the only one saying this, to be clear, I don't like talking about myself, but to be clear, the seminaries are full of conservative young men, traditionally minded at the very least. The FSSP, the SSPX, the Institute of Christ the King, they're all reporting basically record ordinations and record enrollment to the point where they're turning good men away because they don't have the resources to have for all of them. The diocesan seminaries are apparently in a similar situation, not in terms of record vocations, but at least men of the kind of mind you want to have in the seminaries, to the point where even the Jesuit leadership is kind of freaking out about it a little bit. That's not to say things are perfect or that vocations are going to be great, but half the men are not of that. I would dispute even the idea that half the bishops are like that, even though you can find greater evidence for it. If this is where you are, you may want to unplug from the internet for a while. Here's Father Z's response. I get it. I really do. I'm not sure that a long, systematic answer will help as much as a few bullet points with thoughts as they occur to me. You might take these one at a time over as many days and reflect on them. 1. The Church was established by Christ, God, as our ordinary means of salvation. As Lumen Gentium reminds us, anyone knowing and believing this who refuses to enter the Church or stay within cannot be saved. Best line from Lumen Gentium, probably. The devil is really good at being an enemy. The enemy is relentless and knows how to hit us where we are weak. Use the sacraments and sacramentals and ask your guardian angel for help. Some pundits would have you believe that nearly every other priest is some sort of deviant. That's simply not true. Are they there, and are there weird priests? Of course there are. The Church has been systematically infiltrated. I like Father Z for a reason. Again, the enemy is really good at being an enemy. That said, even the wickedest, weirdest, or most wearisome priest have confessed the Eucharist and absolve your sins. Father gives you the creeps. Even disgusting leeches and maggots have their salutary use in medicine. Sometimes they are all you've got, and then they are a blessing. Yes, I will tell you and everyone else to go to confession, but not because of what you have written here. Go to confession when you are aware of mortal sins you haven't confessed. However, I'll remind everybody that effect of the sacrament of penance is also to strengthen us against temptations. You, sir, are being tempted. The enemy has gotten a crowbar into your head, and he's prying away, trying to get you to distance yourself from the means of our salvation, Holy Church. Fight temptations to avoid the Church. There's merit and grace in that fight. If the situation of the Church where you are is truly that corrupt, it is really the case that you can't find a good parish or chapel, maybe it's time for you to move. But that would be hard. Of course it would be hard. On the other hand, if your right eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and throw it away. It is better that you lose one of your members than your whole body be thrown into hell. Sometimes you have to make the hard call for the sake of your immortal soul. Life is short and eternity is, well, not. Is it worth it to stay where you are when you might relocate? I'm going to pause here. I've had people tell me to relocate because of the recent internet issues I had, which I think are now resolved. I had a conversation with a friend of mine in the tech industry about issues that I've been having, and he gave me a solution that was surprisingly affordable, and it seems to have worked. But I was having people tell me to move. I have access to the traditional liturgy within a reasonable drive, what I consider a reasonable drive, and good priests there from 3 different options. That is priceless, combined with other things. It makes me willing to deal with the weird weather we have in this state and with the internet issues. But if you are not in that situation, it's worth contemplating if you are able to. The diocesan TLM in Tulsa is likely to go away if the rumors are true. And there are people who drive 4 hours to get to that one. 4 hours. To put it another way, you've been spotted by the enemy, pinned down under heavy, well-directed barrage. If you stay where you are, you're toast. Pick up your defense and get out of the foxhole. Yeah, etc., etc. I'm convinced that even wicked and stupid priests take the seal of confession seriously. All evidence points to him being correct on that. When it comes to the seal, at least they are like different men, and God is strong in them when it comes to keeping their mouths shut. Another phenomenon I've noticed, and many priests can have the same observation to me, we amazingly seem not to remember the content of 99% of the confessions we hear. It's a mystery. I have noticed that too, by the way. I have noticed that too. I have had priests tell me this. Ordinary form priests tell me that you have to really jog their memory to make them remember what it is you confessed. They and all of them considered a grace from the Holy Ghost. That is why that the Holy Ghost is why they can't remember. Remember that our sins are not only forgiven there, but forgotten, except for the balance you have to pay for them. And even bad priests in quotes, will report that this is true for them. Obviously, terms and conditions apply, such as the exception here being Rupnik, who used the confession as a means for his own evil deeds. And he goes on and on and on. I mean, if you need a boost onto why to stay, go read Father Z's article. I'll have it linked in my show notes at returntotradition.org here in a few minutes after this live stream is over. They want you to leave. That's the point. Any connection to the old faith, while they build their ape of the church, or finish building it, is an impediment to what they're doing. Don't let them force you into a situation where you may lose your soul over a decision you made because of the evil they're doing. Go read up on what the church has to say about heretics, by the way, about their membership in the church. And take some solace in knowing that you were born at a time of God's choosing for a purpose. And that entire purpose may be to just stay in the church and to bear witness to the faith. We all have crosses to carry. They're all different for every one of us. But it could be that a long drive periodically on a Sunday to get to a mass might be it. And remember, wherever else you go, when the man of sin arrives, it will get worse, to the point where the true sacrifice will be buried, if the man of sin arrives in our lifetime, which I'm not convinced that he will be. All right, folks, let me take a look in the live chat here. Raymond says that the proverbial proof is in the pudding, and the actions of Francis should display his contempt for Catholic teaching. That's why would he want anyone to join the faith? Well, let me put it to you this way. He has repeatedly told people to just say where they are and be just good, whatever it is. Ninth Crusade, didn't take it as a disrespect. I'm just telling you why I'm just so adamant about not leaving. But I do have, it looks like, the issue resolved to the point where my live stream tomorrow morning, I will probably try to do at a higher level of visual grade to see if the system I bought can handle it. Damien says, with the new document set to be released, it'll be up to the bishops whether or not they keep the diocesan-based societies. St. Gregory's Society was suppressed in New Haven. Right. That's the other thing. And also, people tend to forget this. The FSSP, since this is the one I'm always asked about, the FSSP and groups like them operate in every diocese at the invitation and will of the local ordinary. Cardinal Cupich could kick out the FSSP from Chicago tomorrow if he wanted to. He kind of did that already with the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest. Their flagship parish is in Chicago and has no public masses, and hasn't for a couple of years now. Even though Francis told to the face of the prior general of the Institute of Christ the King Sovereign Priest to keep doing what they're doing in a spirit of communion and unity and all the rest. That didn't cause Cupich to allow their masses to be said publicly. Soldier of Mary, there are theological reasons we want the traditional mass, and it's not only a language. The traditional mass is a lot more than just the Latin. There's a lot more to it than that. It's something like 85% difference between the traditional mass and the Novus Ordo. All right. They had as many as 400 at that TLM in New Haven. Yeah. As the popularity of a particular place to get to get the traditional mass does never stop them from suppressing it. Look what happened in Australia, in Melbourne. Didn't stop them at all. All right. Let's take a look here finally. And any final thoughts in the live chat before we wrap this up? I have an interesting video, by the way, today. For those of you interested, it'll be about Malachi Martin. And if you want to know of anything he said that was prophetic sounding, you'll hear it in today's video on Malachi Martin, where he warned 30 years ago of the attempt to do to the papacy what Francis's study document now says on the papacy. You know, that topic that kind of came in and then immediately went away in the online discourse because of the TLM and then the vegano stuff. Yeah. We're not going to let that one disappear. So Malachi Martin had a lot to say on it. In fact, so much so that I have to do it in multiple videos. But everything he said was a warning, was possibly the most prophetic stuff he ever said. That's great, Soldier of Mary. But again, it's not the there's reasons for keeping it in an ancient language, and that's one that you can't manipulate and run willy-nilly all over the language. But anyway, I'm not going to debate this. This is not the point of this. Jesus says, I don't know, whip tips. Jesus Gonzalez says, incidentally, pray for the once Catholic dear leader whose family is subjecting him to bad treatment very publicly. Yes, I purposely was avoiding the political discussion from last night on this, but it's very clear that, very clear after watching that his wife should be ashamed of herself. Absolutely should be, as should his children. Everybody around him should be ashamed of themselves. Whip Tip says, Malachi Martin interestingly mentioned both the SSPX and SSPV as being the valid underground church. I did get an email from somebody asking me about the independent priests and underground church comments he's made before, if I knew how to get in touch with them. I've got a friend who watches my streams who knew Malachi Martin in life. I will ask, if you're watching this, let me know in an email or call me later and see if that's what he was talking about. But I do suspect it was the SSPX, the SSPV, and then some independent priests. Again, with independent priests, you have to discern carefully. I mean, you just have to. That's, if you're in that situation where those are the only sacraments you're going to trust, you have to discern very, very, very carefully what you're doing. I can't make those decisions for other people either. Dwayne says the SSPV, he believes they're a sedevacantist. Yes, they are a sedevacantist. They're the most high profile of their priest is Father William Jenkins, one of the original sedevacantist priests who left the SSPX. And actually, he is, as traditional priests go, one of the most charitable I've ever seen in discussing things, in conversing with non-traditionalists. Doesn't denigrate them as not being Catholic. That's especially remarkable for a sedevacantist priest. I hold him in high regard, even if I disagree with him on sedevacantism personally. All right, folks. Thanks very much for tuning in today. As always, pray for the church. And I'll have these things up at my returntotradition.org within a few minutes of now. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.